If your approach is how you are going to solve the common problem of an organization, you'll be a natural leader that people want. I think the hard part on the large side is the politics of it, that I think a lot of people will be like, hey, but I did everything right and I still didn't get the corner office. That's because you didn't understand you didn't understand that there's another part of the game, and that is power and influence. If no one's going to be able to understand what this thing does and how it helps somebody, who are you going to get to pay for it? To take the risks to be an entrepreneur, you do have to have a fundamental belief that you'll make it work. A lot of entrepreneurs, especially if it's new to them, they're terrified that they're not going to look like they knew the right answer, that they're going to make a mistake. So they often don't take the right risks out of fear.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Technocratic Podcast, where my guests and I share practical insights and wisdom about product and engineering and executive management so that you can jump into top 1% of leadership and stay there. Today, our guest is Marc Haskelson, a long-term executive and CEO. Marc has led organizations and divisions in a number of different industries, including marketing, consulting, HIPAA, PCI compliance, even media, and many more. He's held roles as a CEO, GM, biz dev. Marc and I got to know each other in the last few years, and I was always really impressed by his natural entrepreneurial abilities, his skills at building great teams, and just creating a strong company culture. We're really excited to have him on the show. Welcome to the podcast, Marc.
Bobby, thank you for letting me join you. My pleasure. I look forward to, I don't know how insightful, but I'll share all the mistakes I've made, and hopefully I'll help someone else avoid those pitfalls.
That's right. No, this is going to be great, Marc. And we're just going to leap right into it. You started a company successfully, ran it for many, many years. I also started a company back in the early 2000s, ran that. Not as long as you ran your company, but it was certainly a massive learning experience. I mean, I was doing a little bit of everything in the early days. Tell us a little bit about, there's a lot of startups happening these days. A lot of our audience is starting companies. When you start a company, what are the big things that you sort of start to realize that maybe you didn't know before? What can you tell our listeners about the lessons that you kind of learned in those early days of beginning an organization, a company?
Well, there's a lot there, right? A couple, let's say, low-hanging fruit ones is it will take you twice as long and twice as much money to do just about anything. Right. So that brilliant idea that really looks like it's going to work, you can pretty much count on, no matter how well you thought it through, that there is going to be a catch. The other is really, I see so many businesses that they have great ideas, but they really haven't thought through how are they really going to be a profitable organization, right? So, how does this really solve a client's problem? How are they going to pay for it? And does that, even if it's on the back of an envelope, does that add up to a company that will make a profit, or, at least get through the first couple of years? Not, the we'll make it up in volume thing is one. I'm like, man, guys, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. I think that last piece is a huge part of it. I think these days, obviously the startup scene in the US is going bonkers right now with a lot of the AI. So a lot of people are starting companies, a lot of engineers are starting companies, product people are starting companies. And I do notice, because I'm an investor in some of them, and so are you, that they sometimes leave out the profitability question until it's too late or it's gone too long or whatever. But if somebody's like an engineer starting a company, doesn't know much about business maybe, but has a really sharp mind when it comes to technology, how should they get that expertise about saying, all right, well, this is an actual viable business model? Would just contact friends, acquaintances? How should they do that?
No, it's a great question. So I think obviously there's tools like this podcast that you can, try to do some research and understand, let's say, the basic tools and techniques. All right. Because sometimes it's a simple, I've met people where I'm like, well, if you made a pro forma in a spreadsheet that, how does this add up? How much you're spending, how much you think you're going to make? And it's often that simple, oh, I didn't, no, I never looked at it that way. Okay. Mm-hmm. The other is really, and I think, I know for me personally and most successful entrepreneurs I know had some sort of social circle whether it was a business relationships, whether it was, I was very fortunate in that, my father was a pretty good executive, and he was a guy, even if he didn't understand anything about the industry I was in, he would give me a sounding board about what the issues or what the questions might be from someone else's perspective. But I did find that, I was one of those folks who is, you never know who that person that you meet standing on a line, or at an event, the role they can play. So, I've also found that just being open, this is another one that I find, let's say a lesson learned. You have a good idea. Okay. Nothing's that secret. Okay. You know how many times I've come, I can't tell anybody about this. It's probably where I'm like, listen, my general feeling is, not that you should publish everything about your plans, but that don't be afraid to have that conversation with someone that you may not really know that deeply. Often it's somebody in another industry, so I wouldn't necessarily call your competitor, but getting feedback from somebody who has no idea what you do and what for example, so much of this is technology driven. If you can't explain it to your mother, right? And sometimes it's as simple as that. If you can't say, if no one's going to be able to understand what this thing does and how it helps somebody, who are you going to get to pay for it?
Exactly.
Right. And I do think that applies everything from some of the most advanced cybersecurity things I've seen to some of the most basic, direct, infomercial stuff you see on TV. Right. If you can figure out if you can't articulate how it solves your target person's problem, and try that out on a bunch of different people before you're at that really important meeting where your entire company's future is on the line, you want to practice this a little bit, let someone, and don't be afraid. The other thing is as we talk more about, let's say, developing the people around you, I was comfortable asking just about anybody in my organization their feedback on something.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Often they do something that they a perspective you never would have gotten.
Oh yeah, it happens all the time. Like you think this person won't know something about what you're dealing with as a senior executive, but they'll often have the most insightful stuff to tell you. I mean, and in the early days, you're kind of all in it together too, so it's good to share. Yeah. I think people do. Startup founders definitely seem to over optimize for keeping things secret, but so much of it is just in the execution that, if you put your ideas out there and stuff, like executing on that idea is a whole different ball of wax. So who's going to do that? That's a big question. What I found difficult in my first startup was the, having to, they say work on the business versus work in the business. You're wearing multiple hats. You're probably the chief revenue officer, the chief product officer, the chief everything. How should you transition out of doing too much in the business and work more on the business? Like, how did you do that?
So I think some of that is mindset. Right. In that, being realistic of where your strengths and weaknesses are, and then understanding that there are some things you're not good at. Right. And that it is better to spend a little money or let something go than to try to do everything yourself. The other thing I found is that you really, at some point, no company will grow if you do not bring in people. If you're doing everything yourself, you have a great, let's say, lifestyle business, but you're never going to be able to grow if you're really doing everything. So that initial leap of faith in sharing or bringing someone in to help you build your company, I've seen that come from many different places, right? That sometimes that's a peer that who you've done business with before in some capacity. Sometimes that's a guy I did really well. And over the years, I still advocate for this is you'd be surprised if you approach some non-traditional arenas. Okay. And I know you've asked me about this before, but some of my best customer service people, right, was a waiter or a waitress I met. Right. And then, after seeing their skill set saying, look, I got a problem. Do you think you could handle that? And you'd be surprised. A lot of, let's say, over the years, different business I've been in, I've had some very non-traditional people. Some people have a knack or aptitude because, and by the way, the reason I say it that way is usually the other problem for an entrepreneur is usually limited funds. Okay. Even if you have, some substantive financial backing, you have a lot of things you got to decide where you're going to spend your money. right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a limited resource, right? So I was always very comfortable being open, having a conversation. If I found somebody I thought, was good. I mean, I was at the beach with my wife last week, and it's the guy sitting next to us, very gregarious, very outgoing. And after sitting next to him for most of the, let's say for a couple hours at the beach, she looked at me, she goes, "If you were still working, you would have hired him as sales, would you?" I said, "Absolutely. That guy's a great, that guy's a natural born, you give someone like that a target and some guardrails and they'll kick ass for you." But back to your original question, you cannot do it yourself. And until you look in the mirror and make that decision of what is the best place to put your time and what are the things that you really shouldn't be doing, you're always going to be gating the growth of your company.
Right. That is actually interesting from the standpoint of being able to decide if you're the CEO or the founder, like what is the important stuff. And just stay focused on that. Because one of the things that I think catches all of us founders is this idea that, well, I know I can do a better job on this one thing than anybody else. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to do these 50 other things too. And it actually has a huge negative effect on the overall company and stuff, because the most important thing, you're not putting your effort as much as you could in that. So developing that instinct for a new founder, I think takes time, right? It's usually not just out of the box. Like you might be a super smart guy or gal and you're just doing a startup and you start learning what's important in the company and being able to focus on just the important things. That takes time, right? It's not an overnight thing.
And look, you need to trip and fall a bunch of times, right? And one of the things I also think a lot of entrepreneurs, especially if it's new to them, they're terrified that they're not going to look like they knew the right answer, that that they're going to make a mistake. So they often don't take the right risks out of fear. Versus I think the ones that have been more successful, it's not that they're reckless, it's they're not afraid to look stupid. Okay. And I'm using, a very basic term is, they're not afraid to walk into a room and be like, "Look, I don't think I know the right answer," whether it's the people they're selling to, their investors or their employees. They're willing to walk in and say, "Look, I'm admitting that this is something I need to work on and I'm looking for ideas." Doesn't mean you have to follow what people give you, but those one or two, let's say, the example I would give is in my earlier career, my ego often prevented me from doing that. And the mistakes I made, or let's say and like I said, learning, to your point, there are very few people naturally born with this, right? You make mistakes along the way, and some are fortunately not too bad, and some kill companies, right? And as a guy, fortunately, I've never killed a company, but I've seen my peers do that. I've seen another entrepreneur where I'm like, "Well, why are you doing that?" They're like, "Well, because whatever." And you're like, you really thought about that from all angles. What do you think about that a little longer before you necessarily put your foot in the, draw the stake, the line in the sand. That's your only option.
I think founder ego is a huge thing. I definitely think companies go slower when founders are not able to admit their gaps in their abilities or their weaknesses or whatever. Sometimes it has multiple year effects on the speed of the growth of the company if they can't just be like, for example, look, I was able to get the product from 0 to 1, but to professionalize the product, maybe to give it an amazing UI, that's not me. Somebody else has got to take that over. If you can control your ego, you can scale probably better than a lot of people. And it's a weird kind of thing that founders who start even reasonably successful companies just get huge egos because they feel like, "Oh my God." And at some level, they should, because they from nothing created something, and that's difficult. But there's rarely a human who can do it all. Product, sales, marketing, HR, you don't really have the answers to everything. Let's just be real. Other people do. So get good at finding those other people and sliding them in place and making a good team. Now that's something you're awesome at. You find all these amazing people in all walks of life. My big question to you is how do you do it? How do you meet somebody on the beach and all of a sudden you've got that instinct. Can other people get this instinct? How did you develop it?
Well, I think I'm going to bridge off the ego statement because I think it will tie into this. So first of all, you do to take the risks to be an entrepreneur, you do have to have a fundamental belief that, you'll make it work. Like, you're not that you're invincible, but you have to believe that. You have to see a path. You have to see how it is successful, not how it fails. Right. So there is an ego that I've seen common. The tough part is the balance of it. Right. Mm-hmm. The balance of it, which now comes to you're asking the kind of how did you, over the years, how did I find good people? Some of it was I found I had it. I think you can learn this. Okay. Mine was, I moved a bunch of times growing up. So if you change schools all the time, as a young kid, you have to learn how to read a room fast. Okay. Also, you have to get beat up or you get hang out with the cool kids, whatever it is. Okay. But whether you're an engineer walking, in a drier environment or you're in an accounting space, whatever is your, when you look around you, you tend to see some people who are having an influence. Okay. Mm-hmm. So the thing I found was by watching that interaction, and that in today's world that can be online in many different ways. But if you see somebody who's exhibiting, well, first of all, if you can identify what you think your problem is, and then you can see somebody exhibiting the traits that solve that. I was very quick to say, I don't care. I removed the blinders of where I encountered that. Okay. Whereas I've seen, and not that it's wrong, I've also seen many of the groups that I've worked with, their presumption was we're going to go for the best, the best thing we can afford. Right. So sometimes they're not getting the best person. They're getting the best person they can afford, whether it was a degree, a particular background, versus I looked at it very differently saying, look, to use the salesperson, almost every organization I found, their biggest problem is somebody who can make it rain. Okay. And usually as entrepreneurs, we become the people who make it rain. Right. But, you start learning quickly that there are pieces of each business, whether it's programming or the sales and marketing component, that there's some people who are really good at things. If you watch them and you keep an eye out for them in any environment, you end up getting these opportunities that you wouldn't have found otherwise. But I don't think for people who don't have, let's say, that intuition, I would say the fallback that I've seen work equally well is really step back and look at a problem, look at your company from a 360 and really understand where your weakness is and then go look to fix that. Right. I think often, especially entrepreneurs in every environment, they tend to like, I'm really smart. I can figure it out. Right. And the next thing you know is like, yeah, you can figure it out. But you do realize someone, you may have taken the longest, most expensive possible route to get out there. And then if you just, look, slow down and say, look, our problem isn't, pick your problem, right? Figure out what the impact is and decide whether or not this is, what is it? I'm trying to think of a little funny analogy, but basically what is a symptom versus a problem, right? The actual cause. Right? Yeah. Try to get to what are the root causes and fix those things. Yeah. And those two, let's say that balance has been mostly what made me successful.
Yeah. It is difficult, obviously, to do good talent acquisition in any company, to really hire well and all that. I started realizing as I started getting older that if I was going to work with somebody closely, I needed to like them. Earlier in my career, I was like, you know what, as long as they can do the job, I don't need to like them. Now at this age, I'm like, they really have to have the right personality, the right skill set. Both those things have to be there. I have to connect with them at some level. So what do you do, in your opinion? Like, you find, let's say, the world's greatest go-to-market person, and as good as you're the founder, you've been doing it for a couple of years, and you find the very perfect person. But he or she is just like, their personality just doesn't mesh with you. Do you hire them for your fledgling startup, or do you say, no, I'm going to wait it out, find somebody else who does fit my personality?
So that is a really great question, because I was going to be a contrarian as you were saying it. I was going to be a contrarian and say, look, I'll throw it the opposite. I've seen many more mistakes made where someone hired who they liked, who really wasn't very good.
Right.
Okay. And then because they liked them, they got along with them, they either had common traits, which means they were collectively they were missing something because they had a common look and speak. But here's let's say where I would give the edge of that I've used. There are people that I don't necessarily like. Okay. In other words, they're not someone I would want to go hang out with and spend time with, but I trust and respect them with their skill set. Okay. So the issue of trust and integrity. So there are, there's been many people I did a lot of business with both internally and externally that I would not have considered someone that was, let's say, who I would have liked. But I was able to, my recommendation is they look like me, they sound like me, that makes me feel good, and focus on I trust this person. I would inherently believe that they really are going to fix this, even if they would disagree with me on, from politics to food. Okay. And there seems like minor things, but if you have someone, like for example, if there's 5 of you and, you have somebody who's, let's say, a vegan and somebody else who's a whatever, lunch becomes complicated, right? You know what I'm saying? Yeah. But I would say it's not, obviously the ideal scenario is someone that you really like, that you can, that fixes what you want. Yeah. But I would say I would not be afraid of hiring someone. Actually, I would go one step further. You need a contrarian in your mix.
Yeah.
Okay.
And by
they
really
shouldn't be contrarian just for that. But you need somebody who's not going to be afraid to say, hey, I think this is a bad idea. We shouldn't do it this way. And that might piss you off.
Here's my theory about it. I think by really liking somebody in a professional settings, I personally don't mean that like I have to like the same food as them. I don't think you were implying that either, but no. I just mean like we have to get along in a professional setting. You have to have a positive attitude. You have to have a solution mindset, blah, blah, blah. I think if you're in the early stages of a startup, every single person has to be pointing in the right direction. So my view is like, I don't know if I would hire a contrarian. Not only just to like be a contrarian, but just like if there's a super smart guy, but he's a contrarian, I don't know if that takes us in the right direction, Yeah. Once you get bigger as a company, you can absorb those people better, in my opinion. You know what I mean? Like you can just be like, all right, this person has some other thoughts. 1 or 2 of their ideas in a given year might actually work out. Okay, wonderful. Then a startup with a small group, I have a little bit of a feeling of like it's just harder when one person's always going their own path.
Eliminate as many challenges you have. So what I think is a better word for it, right, is as I agree with you, like implies like a social liking is more of a common set of beliefs might be the right word. For me, I prefer people who are direct. Okay. I prefer people who show integrity. So though the liking of them became, that I was, I think it's important to, especially as a culture of an organization starts happening, right? And culture often can be the thing, it can hurt you or it can save you. Right. So I think what you're alluding to is, look, you want to build a place where people really want to be there, right? You're going to be there a lot of time. You're going to want people who are, who view this extra, it's a lot easier just to get a day job that, just pays and you don't really care. Most people, especially in small organizations, you're bound at the hip. Right. So I think the trick would be understand what is the important things around the people that you want around you. Right. And make that the like, not the they're gregarious, for example. Right. It's for example, I know people that, they have all, over the years, I've had several people that were way on the spectrum. Okay. And actually, it's pretty common in the technology space. So their social graces are completely off the wall, right? But that doesn't mean that they don't have integrity and they can't be, they can't respect the boundaries if you share what are the important boundaries to you.
Yeah, that's well said. That's
and by the way, the reason I'm sorry, the reason I push on it is I've seen a lot of companies where like I hired my friend, okay, and I'm like, Did
That's
you
the common
evaluate that
mistake.
person?
I mean,
Did you evaluate that person on really the business need, or you trusted them because you're your friend and you assume that they're going to help you out, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes great, sometimes.
Oftentimes it does not work. Yeah. Now, Mark, one thing that you were great at is developing people. So somebody comes in, and maybe they don't have all the skill set, and then you were always a guy who invested in people and, kind of taught them the stuff they didn't know, and got them inculcated with the culture and all that type of stuff. What's the secret to doing that? What should company founders and CEOs kind of think about in terms of doing that the right way? Because so many companies have tens of millions of dollars worth of training programs, but really when you go and talk to the rank and file, they don't care. They're not connected. They don't know what the mission is. I remember one day going ages ago, did a whole survey of like the engineering team, and I went one by one to each of the engineers. Most of them had no idea what the company did for their business, as far as their business is concerned. They knew some of the products, but they didn't know. And it was like astounding, that gap. And you're good at closing. Yeah, you see it all the time. How do you close that gap?
So that there's a lot of different paths. So let me take one or two, and you tell me which one you want me to explore further. One is, especially when it's a small organization, flat open door. Okay, like just look there. You don't need a bunch of management layers. You shouldn't. I'm not saying there aren't times where you need to close the door and have a serious conversation about something, but don't be afraid to make sure everyone on the team understands what the problem is and has a voice. Okay, because the second part is what I did, which was I learned my lesson for not doing this earlier in my career. Okay, two mistakes I made. Right. And learn to overcome them. One is talk to your people. Okay. You'd be surprised how committed, how intelligent, how unexpected, feedback you can get from, and depending on the business, anybody. Right. There's many stories in business where, the guy who swept whoever swept the floors pointed out, something. Right. But most of the time what happens is I did it from a practical perspective. I made it a point of, one, being open about big decisions and bringing or hearing people's opinions. Doesn't mean we did it. It just means listening to them. The other thing I think is important is, just the general concept of, I invested probably more time than most people would in understanding what the want of the team was. Okay. So both professionally and personally. Okay. So there's a lot of people that, either they pointed out something professionally that was really important to them and therefore a great role for them to take on, or there was something going on in their life that if you could work around it for them, you got a much better, resource, or commitment to the company. Right. The other mistake is just, hanging on too long, not, being afraid of once you sink into something, saying we can't change it. My attitude was, look, if a consensus felt that this was a right or wrong way to go, we should take that seriously. Even, by the way, if it went against my belief, and this is where it goes back to the ego. Right. At a certain point, you start, if you are always saying I have to be right, there's, I'm just going to find a way to prove that I'm right. Your people aren't going to trust you. They're not really going to be dedicated. They're not going to be committed versus if you turn around and what I would often say, and this is something that I would advocate for any entrepreneur, when it goes well, team gets credit. When it goes wrong, it's your fault. Simple as that. Right. Like, and as long as you go to bed every night with that going on in your head, I think you tend to get really loyal, hardworking. Look, they may not have the skill sets, a third element I would say is also, I was not afraid to make cuts. Okay. I think a lot of times, as much as I tried very hard not to, if I didn't think someone was a good fit, I would remove it almost immediately. I had I had a strong belief in that a very good initial training program, even for a 3-person company. Sit down and really say, what's the 10 things this person has to know to really do this? If in that first, whether it's a day or a week or 2 weeks, you see behavior that doesn't fit, you confront it right there. And if you can't resolve it, it doesn't work. End it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Cause I see it so often. Entrepreneurs like, well, I need them. I'm like, no, everyone is replaceable, including yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Right. You have to be, be pregnant, don't be afraid to look that clearly and say, hey, look, this is just not really the right long-term thing.
Mm-hmm.
Get out of it. Do it nicely, by the way. It doesn't have to be done in a mean way, but it was, those three things I felt very comfortable doing because I didn't do that earlier. Mm-hmm. Earlier in my career, it had to be my way. I really didn't spend as much time understanding people on the team and what was their motivators and what their strengths and weaknesses were. Yeah. And, over time, really.
Yeah. It's funny.
The third one, can I add one more to it, actually? I apologize.
Go ahead. No, add on to it.
Speak to your clients. Spend as much time as you can. Talk to the people who use your software, your application. I mean, I was almost all intellectual property SaaS applications. Right. Do not be afraid to pick up the phone and have a conversation with an unhappy client. You can learn so much more. And often what was construed as product needs to make a change to address a client's need. Yeah. Often if you really spoke to the client, they were willing to forego it. Right. Mm-hmm. If they understood the business's long-term, what the issues were. Right. Because I think that's another thing I see, especially in technology. Some people are like, well, we have to get it perfect. I'm like, look, it'd be awesome if you could have it perfect. It solves everything. It's just not realistic. Mm-hmm. Right. And if you're coming from that kind of mindset, the only way to balance that is I used to take calls and it became to be a joke. I would take calls after hours all the time. Mm-hmm. And people would be like, aren't you the president? And I'm like, yeah. They're like, why are you taking this customer service call? I'm like, 6 o'clock, everyone went home. You cared. It was important to you to call. Why wouldn't I pick up the phone? And in the end, I just learned a lot, much more than I would have off of reports and what, there's great technology, but what Pendo would have told me about utilization would have been very different from the client saying, it's not what I want.
Yeah. It's interesting. Going back to the developing people, it seems like these large corporations like the Amazons of the world, they have just huge development programs. And then everybody else kind of, sort of just throws you into the fire if you're a new employee or something. And it seems like for a lot of companies, it's kind of hard for them to hit the sweet spot in the right way. Either some intense thing or it's nothing. Most of the time it's nothing. Not much of a training program. I think you need to have some kind of customized development programs for different departments. And I think that they have to be not too short and not too long. You want people to jump in and do their job and experience it and learn and all that. But you also want to prepare them, especially if it's like client facing and things like that. I find it surprising that nobody's really cracked the code on people development when they first get hired into a company. It takes CEOs who know what they're doing, like yourself, who have a knack for it, who will create their programs and run their programs. There's no like kind of out of the box solution I find that like says, okay, here's the instant structure. Maybe it's an HR product or something. Now here's the instant structure we're going to give you. Now run your people through this and they're going to be amazing 2 to 3 weeks, or you'll figure out that they're not amazing. And so there's no sort of like standardized way to do any of that stuff. Like, for example, compare that to like sales, what BDRs do, what account executives do, what other kinds of salespeople do. There's playbooks for all of that. I don't ever find that there's just like playbooks for how to develop people in your company. It's all just a crapshoot. You got to just figure it all yourself. Yeah. Do you agree with that?
Or it feels very well. No, I agree with you. It's a problem it's a general problem, and I think some companies are very lucky that they have someone on their team that is just intrinsically more nurturing. Yeah. Okay. And by the way, candidly, if you were to ask the people, let's say in my life, yes, my wife and my kids, they would say I'm the most I do not explain things well. I'm not known for my patience on things. But but I do think that there are some processes that anyone can use. Okay. So one is, look, there's usually take the time and say, look, if I was new, what are the 3 things I really need to know? Okay. So in other words, if you're going to come into, let's take finance or healthcare or whatever, you have to understand the basics of something, right? So find a set of podcasts that they can go listen to. Okay. There's usually something that you need to teach them about your business. Same thing. Usually you can identify that. The trick that I found or the thing that I found to be very important was in those first, let's call it 2 days. Let's keep it simple. Most small companies only have 2-3 days of training. Most of it's on the job, or whatever. Yeah. Make it very clear that you are going to evaluate how well they take on the task. Okay. Okay. Because what happens is you can't really that quickly, you can't identify whether or not they're going to be, have all the things you need for them to be a great, whatever role. All right. But what you can see, you gave them something to do. They understood how to attack a problem, digest it. I implemented it and I learned it at AT&T when I was at AT&T. And that was AT&T's theory on new employees was they gave you training manuals and they tested. And if you failed, you were fired. Okay. So like there was no middle ground. Right. So, when you see that kind of carnage in the first week at a company, now, by the way, AT&T, they did extensive testing before you even showed up, but my point being, even at a 3-person company, if the person comes in and you say, hey, look, I need you to do these 3 things, this is how you're going to learn. And they jump in and they engage it and they ask questions. That was the other thing we would force them to ask questions. That in itself is indicative of someone who will be successful on your team, right? What I did see was if you structured it that way. So like I said, those 2 things are, hey, you're going to give a product demo. Let's say this is one that I found very useful. They have to learn the product. Okay. So whether or not they have to be able to present the product as a demo, but they have to know the product, right? So you give them that task and you give them the task of understanding some basic industry knowledge. Yeah. And 2 days later, have a set of questions that you're going to ask people to evaluate that. And if you didn't see the behavior or what you were looking for, sorry, get rid of it. Right. Or have a very frank conversation. So that's what I find. When it's all said and done, I think training programs, a lot of people try to make training programs into like this intrinsic warm fuzzy, and I'm going to develop you and I want to make you feel at home and all that kind of stuff. That's not really the case. You need to get somebody up to speed where they can contribute to the organization quickly and efficiently. And if they can take on a task and deliver on it, is usually the first thing that you see. Everything else falls out from that. Yeah. So, on there's no great tool. That's the tool I use.
That's the tool. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. I mean, you got to keep it practical. I think you probably have to invent it yourself for your own company. Yeah. There's no kind of standard thing or tool out there. But yeah, I mean, there's people who know how to do it well, and maybe you can find those people in your network if you're an entrepreneur. I do think one aspect of developing people in the early stages of their employment, and it's maybe a more earlier stage company itself, is like this element, like you said, like there's always like one thing that they have to be able to do really well, like sell or learn the product to sell, or do something that's core to their job, and you got to test them on that thing super fast. So I think that's an important point that you made. So talking about company culture here a little bit, there's you've been a CEO for 15 plus years. You've seen the cultures of all sorts evolve and devolve. One thing is, how do you define in your own way what's a good culture to you? If you just look at a company macroscopically, maybe it's got 100 people in it. How do you decide, this is a good culture? Because it's not just, of course, like a big part of it is probably in kind of like, okay, the company is growing, so it shows up on in the finances of the company. But besides that, how do you decide this is a good or bad culture?
So I also I look at it slightly the opposite. Profitability, financial stability, happy customers usually come from a happy company. Okay, so for me, what I found, and I think this is also something that's universal, and it's not something you have to have a bunch of money to do, is some basic things like, okay, is there a clear understanding across everybody as to what the culture, what the mission of this business is? Okay. And I don't mean fancy, long, crazy mission statements. I mean something simple that everybody can say quickly and effectively. The way I used to explain it was, if you can't go home after the first day at the office of joining a company and go home and tell your significant other, I do this, and this is why I think we do it, right? Then no one's going to get it. Okay. So what happens is the companies this is my belief, and you can rule by the spreadsheet, you can rule by, I think there's a happy medium in the middle, but I think it starts off with is a clear definition of what we stand for. Okay. And what happens is everyone's going to be like, no one's going to say we stand for dishonesty and deception. I mean, but you know what I'm saying? Give them something that really is relative, that you as a team, and the startups, I've done really 6 startups. The ones that succeeded, or let's say did well, there's some that just kind of fizzled out, where as early as possible, we got, the company was able to define specifically what it stood for and how it was going to get that done and why it was doing it. And then everything else fell in behind it. The companies that I saw that struggled were where too many ICPs, unclear definition of the value prop. We're going to do a little bit of everything. We'll do what we have to do to get a deal. No, there are some deals you shouldn't do. Right. And there's some people you shouldn't do business with. And if you don't have some of those guardrails around, you tend to get pulled in when you talk about, let's say, as companies grow and the politics and emotions and all the, let's say the real life crap that flies in there. If you have a common thing that everyone agrees on as to this is what we do, this is what we stand for, that usually saves companies from making expensive mistakes or terminating mistakes.
So you view that as a key part of the culture. Knowing what you
because what happens is some cultures, you see, let's say some cultures where it's going to be all fun beanbags, and we're gonna have a tap, we're gonna have a beer tap, and that's not what makes a good company. That sounds like a fun company. I don't disagree with that, but it's one thing if you turn around and it's like that's our belief is at the end of the day when we've accomplished the 3, let's say. There's many different systems that exist about how to focus, different roles, different tools. But hey, when we get something good done, we know we know the definition of what we need to get done, and we get it done, then we enjoy. That can be money, that can be free time, that can be, I've seen sometimes it's crazy, sometimes it's very common sense. Some people just want to go home and be with their families, right? Give them that opportunity. But I think that's what makes companies successful, versus it's not just, working from home and time off. That doesn't make anybody good, right?
Yeah.
Make them happy.
Culture. Company culture is not like the foosball table. But do you think company culture is more top down or bottoms up, or is it just like a hybrid of both?
That I think is a question subject to the people involved in the business. Okay.
So it's different for every business.
Yeah. So in other words, I've been involved with companies where the founders were just brilliant people that really couldn't, were high on the spectrum and really couldn't communicate with other humans. Okay. But they had other people in the organization that were really strong on how to give the company a culture where, could thrive. Right? Yeah. So it can come from the bottom. Yeah. I do think, but in reality, as much as I'd love to say that, I think in the end, the most successful companies come from, either founders and or management teams and or the original entrepreneur who has a strong belief in something and they're going to lead people in that path.
Yeah. I think it's a top down thing mostly, but you're right.
Because I think otherwise you're, And for one thing, entrepreneurs especially, so if you're going to be a true startup, bootstrapped, whatever, man, you're putting a lot of stuff on the line. You better believe in it, right? And people, the people around you, if you're asking them to make similar sacrifices, you got to really live that.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
And I think leaders who can truly, whatever their strengths and weaknesses are, but leaders who can really portray that to their people tend to work.
Yeah.
Right?
I think culture is in 10% or less of the time, it just happens organically and it turns out fantastic. The rest of the time, well, maybe another 20, 30% of the time, it just happens organically and turns out horrible. I think you have to, in this day and age, be pretty scientific about culture as a leader. And I think you have to, like, maybe you have some inherent personal capabilities that let you do culture easily. But a lot of people, a lot of founders, a lot of CEOs, even of larger companies, I think should spend more time thinking about it and like have a prescription for culture and see if it works and then go to the next thing and the next thing. If it doesn't, because when left to itself, I don't think culture just like randomly develops really well. Like I talked to so many CEOs who are like, my product engineering people are amazing. They can do product, they can do engineering. But if I ask them to take even a simple step towards knowing what the company does or its customers or, and the market and stuff, then, so many CEOs complain that their people just don't care or know anything about that. Then there are CEOs who just seem to just get all that right. They like, they'll do something to solve it. They'll have like a, coffee with the CEO or brown bag lunch thing where just talk about business or something, whatever the CEO wants. But I think you have to be, we live in a complex society. It's getting more and more complex every day. Social media is everywhere. You need to manage, in my opinion, as a CEO, your culture more closely than maybe 10, 15 years ago.
Well, I also think there's greater risk because one of my observations is as you become more and more of a remote workforce, without a strong bond between your people, one, they can have no loyalty and then they just leave when they get whatever, right? Any conflict, they are out the door, right? Or they end up more closely aligned with or feeling closer to your clients than to the company. Right. And now they start doing things. You're like, well, why'd you do that? That wasn't good for us. Well, but, I really feel close to, George, and George has always been there for me. So I'm like, look, George, I'm glad you went to help George out.
That's so common. Put us
in a deep spot.
Especially in customer support.
I do think, and I do think and as much as it can be uncomfortable, because I think some personalities are more introvert versus extrovert. Yeah. And that is two things I've seen, and I don't think they're particularly hard to do. One is I mandated that I had to have, and I had a structured meeting with every employee of the company once a year. Right. Okay. As the company got bigger, I did it with HR involved so that the action items that came from it were handled by other people. But the experience was for every single one of the people who ever worked for me was that at least once that they were going to sit down with me and I was going to understand what was going on with their significant other, what, their health, what their goals were, what their aspirations were, what, feedback on the company. So that there was, it's a good connection. And by the way, you could spend 15 minutes. This doesn't have to be, everyone cringes, I don't have time. I'm already so busy. I'm telling you, do a couple of weeks, do a quick video, Zoom meeting. You're fine. Right. That goes a long way. The other thing that we started doing, or let's say I've done this a couple of times, is for the fact that you have people that are, let's say, not quick to like, that's not my thing. We would send them out to lunch with each other. Yeah. All right. I would send, somebody from each department. And we did this remote as well, but remote, they did it. They all, they ordered lunch and they sat and ate with each other, but they had 3 to 5 specific questions they had to go through. Nothing crazy. Right. But the goal
it's surprising.
The goal wasn't become best friends. The goal was, what is my biggest problem and how your department may be affecting me. Right. And then often many problems were resolved just because, I didn't realize it. Right. I never saw it through accounting's eyes that, if the system is down, X amount of time, clients call in and want their money back. Right. I didn't realize that. We just thought we were doing an upgrade. We didn't think it really mattered. Well, it kind of does. Right. And many of them get pissed off. If you tell them in advance and say, we're going to be shut down Sunday from midnight to 6, no one cares. Right. But if it happens to be the midnight to 6 that somebody was doing something serious on their side, they're pissed.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That was a good segue into this idea that you as a CEO, you're dealing with employees, customers, investors, right? At minimum, partners, of course.
Yep.
What does a CEO need to do to develop that skills? For example, like many of our listeners they're VPs who are trying to break into the C-suite. So they want to become the CTO, the chief product officer. And I always tell these people, I mentor a lot of people like that. And I was like, it sounds a lot more glamorous than it is. Don't get me wrong. It's a great feeling to be the head of something in a whole company. But like, you all of a sudden have a ton of administrative work. And on top of that, now you got to keep a whole new set of people, stakeholders happy. And like product, right? Products usually like the center of a lot of different communications between product and engineering and marketing and sales. That's a good example where like you have to do multi-stakeholder management. And Mark Benioff talks a lot about that. The Salesforce CEO, if you ever listen to any of his talk, you have to like be really good at it. Is the only way to become good at it just to do it? Or can you actually practice it somehow before you get into the C-suite?
That's a good question. I think I'll divide the answer with I'll put a line in the middle. Certain size companies, much larger companies, there's a lot of good training. You can go get a master's online, and I don't mean necessarily go get your master's. I mean like there is tools and techniques for how you are managing those type of complex multiplayer worlds that you can learn a playbook. You can learn a tool that allows you to do that.
Yeah.
Okay? I think the hard part on the large side is the politics of it. Mm-hmm. That I think a lot of people will be like, hey, but I did everything right and I still didn't get the corner office. That's because you didn't understand you didn't understand that there's another part of the game, and that is power and influence. And there's same thing. There's also really good books and podcasts, etc., articles on those issues. Okay, that's big. I found much more, I see much more, where I think is kind of more interesting is the small mid-size. Right. Where you have somebody, that question is, did they want to become, hey, look, I just want to be part of the C-suite, and how do I develop that skill set? Or how do I want to be an entrepreneur? Two different questions. Slightly different question. How to be in the C-suite is, look, understand the common problems of the company. I'll say it slightly differently. If your approach is how you are going to solve the common problem of an organization, you'll be a natural leader that people want at the conference table. Okay. If you're always going to be the person who's to come in and say, here's the problems from my department, my this, why aren't you? Then you are destined to be in that role. Right. Yeah. The common theme that I've seen from the most successful people who've made that leap to let's say getting into the C-suites are really good at understanding that they're, what are the challenges of the organization. And that by solving things for other people, like I call it barter, right? I didn't need a chicken. I needed an egg. You needed a chicken. Okay. So if I got a guy who'll trade me I got a whatever, he'll trade me the chicken. You want the chicken. I want the egg. Now we got a good deal. Sorry, a weird example, but
no, I get it.
It's being able to go into that meeting and say, look, Bobby, you need more resources. I know that. Okay. So if I can get, finance to free up my budget for what you need, I need that released by like this date. So if we can all make each other happy, we all win. Those people tend to be successful and rise to the top very, very. Yeah. They always end up being. They always end up being in the where the big decisions are made, because they're known for being able to solve those problems. Yeah, and I don't think it's gregarious. By the way, some of the biggest introverts I know
can be very successful. Yeah,
because they listen.
They're good listeners. Yeah. I think my own experience tells me that when I see people jump into the C-suite and the ones that get really successful at it in terms of managing lots of stakeholders really well, they usually have a lot of skills around diplomacy and communication, obviously. And they've been doing diplomacy and communication one way or another in different environments for years. And then they get into the C-suite and they're just like still crushing it because they're still diplomatic and good communicators and stuff. There's other aspects of it too, but I find that I don't know if you can learn it unless you just do it. You get in there, You start doing it, you're managing, so let's say you're in product, you're managing sales expectations, you're managing in the engineering team and what their output is, and you're dealing with customer support and all that stuff. You just have to be in that world to quickly learn how to do it right. It's a skill set that not everybody has.
It is, and it can be learned.
Right.
Kind of a way to back into it, especially for smaller organizations that may not have the financial capital. Many of the trade associations, this can be everything from Rotary Club in your town to the trade associations, the big trade associations in each areas we work in. Often they have those kind of training available because they have noticed that's one of the, in the end,
that's
one of the big problems in business. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's many, young entrepreneurs and EOS and TAB, and there's a bunch of different ones. I'm thinking of, I got involved with, let's say, was CompTIA, which is now GTIA. They had a whole bunch of really advanced education on what is these kind of soft skills. It's just not that many people took them.
Not that many people take advantage of it. Yeah.
And I'm finding it's a common in the trade association. Many of the associations have them because they realize that's a very common problem that isn't expensive to fix. Right.
So maybe the training is available somewhere. You just got to find it. Mark, another challenge for CEOs in the C-suite is the pain of scaling. So okay, maybe you different scenarios, like you got a 10-person startup and you just raised your first round, and now you got to go and hire a whole bunch of people, or your sales team is about to experience a lot of growth and you need to scale your processes or something. So is scaling the people, scaling process, all sorts of different for technology people, scaling the product or whatever. As a CEO, though, how do you work with your leaders, like the CTO, the chief product officer, the head of sales? How do you work with them in the right way to help them enable the rest of their department to scale up? Especially in scenarios where, nobody's hit that scale before in their career. Maybe you're going from a $20 million business to a $75 million business or something. Like, how do you help your department leaders to learn how to scale? Is that even possible?
Oh, that's a tough one. And that is where the sad part of being a small growing business is that at some point, I think almost every organization reaches a point that the original people do not have that skill set. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think step one is recognizing that, right? Being in a situation where you can actually, in a safe way with your teams, discuss truly whether or not that person is ever going to be able to really even address this problem. By the way, and what I found is if you make them part of the solution, maybe a little bit ego massaging, is required. Most people, especially if they see that this is a long-term benefit for them, because they're part of a company, maybe they have shares, whatever it is, or they just like being there, they'll go along with it. Right. But as far as the actual scaling thing, this is, I think there is, there's a lot of playbooks you can read or look at, right, to try to understand or watch. When I opened and said, "Hey, it's going to take twice as long, cost twice as much," that's the other thing, right? I think as entrepreneurs, we all have a tendency of
want to go fast. Yeah.
Well, we want to go fast. We think we're invincible. We're sure we're going to figure it out. Right. It becomes, especially the issue of scaling is usually around really exploring to what you shouldn't be doing. Okay. Because usually what I've seen, the things that hurt in scaling is, look, you got to decide, if you really, depending on what the goal is, there is probably something else in your stable of products or people or operations that is not going to do it anymore. Either it's either not right for the business. The infrastructure will collapse. It can't handle the scaling of it. And those are also really tough things that I think as entrepreneurs, we are guilty of not seeing that negative side.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. My answer
this goes back to don't hire your friends because now you got to fire them. I'm sorry. I can't tell my cousin that he can't do this anymore. I'm like, you have to tell your cousin he can't do this anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? It's your job. Step up.
I mean, it seems like that. Yeah. I mean, basically, let's be real. It's pretty rare to get somebody who can do a startup, an SMB, a mid-market company, and an enterprise. Like all four of those things. That's like 1 in a million, or maybe less than that. But you know what I mean. I think
there are people who do it, but it's hard.
There's
it's
people
not
who
common.
do it. I think the trick to scaling is this weird word for this, but simulations. I mean, I learned this in engineering, right?
That's good.
You're going to scale a product. You're going to try to load test that product. Okay, well, you're going to try to scale maybe a sales team. Well, let's see if they can do 50 calls or whatever an hour instead of 10 or whatever it's going to be. Like force the simulation to happen before it actually hits the company or whatever in real life. And you have to try to do that in every place where scaling is needed to get the mindset to change. And then you can figure out who can do it, who can't do it. And then you get the people out that can't do it.
I was trained, I forgot where I learned it. So at the time they called it beachheading. And I'm sure there are better names or better tools, but the concept was along your lines of simulation. The way we were doing it was, I was originally an engineer. Okay. And I remember the concept of guesstimation before you spend a bunch of time, just like, this is roughly add up, right? Which was, hey, if our goal is to be at this revenue, okay, with the current metrics, how many widgets do we have to have? Like how many subscriptions do we have? And then back into it, which was often that exercise in a room with the key stakeholders, somebody like, well, okay, but the accounting system won't be able to bill like that. Right. Okay. So that means 12 months from now, we're going to need a billing system, which means we really got to make that decision now. Right. So, so the idea of simulation, or pro formas, whatever, but you're right. Map it, be able to really say, this is what you want as the outcome and fill in as many of those blanks and then back it up from there. That's that at least for me, that was how we handled, big, tough questions.
Yeah. That's a good example. That's a good thought. Last question on the CEO thing. You've been doing this for a while. You had tough times. You had great times. When you're going through some of the tougher times and your team's going through it, maybe you've got a company of 400 or 500 people and, maybe revenue is really down. Your market is in trouble for some reason or something. And maybe you bounce back one day. Yeah, typical Tuesday. How do you, as a CEO, keep the positivity? Should you try to keep the positivity? Let me say also one side thing is I noticed somewhere around 2014, 2015 in the corporate world, a weird thing started happening which I started calling toxic positivity, where things could be going to shit, but like everybody was going to show up and be like, this is amazing. Things are great. And oh my God, there was one person I worked with. That person was always toxically positive, and it made no sense. It would literally take entire teams and point them in the complete wrong direction because they just weren't fixing the actual problems because they weren't confronting the problems and admitting there were problems. But how do you deal with tough times? Do you try to stay positive? What's the value in that? Or are you like positive, realistic? Like, how do you approach the difficult times and getting through them?
I think step one is, you need to share when there is a problem. You need to share it. Don't cover it up. Okay. So there's, you can be positive about, look, we're really off on our revenue forecast, right? That's not being not positive. That's saying the reality is we are not whatever. Okay. By the way, something also to do with metrics, because I find what happens is if everyone has a clear set of metrics, then you can the enemy is not each other, right? The enemy is the problem itself. Okay, so like if you ever read The Goal, right?
Yeah.
This concept of how to help people think as a unit to find positive outcome. But I do think you need to be often hope for your staff.
Yeah.
Right. In other words, if you just say, look, everything's bad and it's horrible and it's never going to get better and we're all screwed, that doesn't help anybody. Okay. You can say, look, we have gotten here. We made some mistake along the way. can we not vilify anybody, but can we figure out what broke?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now we can focus on how do we not do this going forward, or how, what is it that we need to change in our operations and our positioning, whatever it may be, to get where we need to be. I think is not toxically positive. It's more realistic, right? It becomes like, look, no, what we do, I think I've seen many organizations. You're right. No one really says where the problem is. Right? Everyone's afraid to be like, look, that's wrong. Fill in what was wrong. There's nothing wrong with putting that on the table, or ways that, different ways of, say what you mean. You don't have to say it in a mean way, but you should say what you mean. And then you presume that your people around you will say what they mean and mean what they say. Mm-hmm. Right. Like if you hold everyone accountable with that type of communication style, right? I found that worked really well for me. Right. So like I was, I had to dispel some of those very tough information, but I did it in a constructive way. Like, look, we can fix this. Right. Okay. Not everything's great. No, the building's on fire. Nothing is great. Hey, the building's on fire, but I got a fire hose and I got a fire extinguisher. You take the fire extinguisher. I'm going to take the fire hose, but the building's still on fire. Okay. We're not going to gloss over that. Right. This isn't go get lunch. We're going to be fine.
Right. Yeah. I like the positive, realistic combo. It can't be overly pessimistic. You can't be toxically positive. Just positive, realistic. Like you said, like spell it out. Here's what's happening. Good things, bad things, both be transparent about them. And then get to fixing the problem. I found that most good teams love fixing problems. Like that's what they're there for. So if you rally them around the cause of fixing the problem and stuff, they get to it. So that's a good feeling. Couple more things then we will wrap up. I wanted to ask you about, the industry you spent so long in, which I also had a little connection to for a while. I started I've been a CTO for many years, so security and compliance has always been the bane of my existence. I probably have done too much of it in one sense as a CTO, but I got involved in PCI compliance back when I was part of a payment processor in 2014. And I remember going through the process of making the entire infrastructure PCI compliant. And it was one of the most difficult projects I'd ever done. Really annoying. And I wished at the time that there was some magical tool out there that would help me solve it, because I'm always thinking about that, about products that can just help me solve these problems. But over the years, it's like PCI compliance has changed a lot in terms of players that are in the market, who offer solutions for companies. And then obviously HIPAA is a big area of compliance that you spent a lot of time in. How do you view the changes in the industry over the last, 5 years or so? Has it gotten different? What are the newer players that, like, you've got Drata and Vanta and all these different types of companies? What do you think about them? Any sort of insight into the compliance industry, specifically like around HIPAA and stuff?
So I think the concept of compliance and risk and cybersecurity are all kind of coming together in many ways, right? They're a related set of challenges, right? So I do think the technology has gotten a lot better at giving people visibility to controls. All right. I do think that there is still, as much as there's been a lot of attention to it, there is still a weakness around, just because we have policies, procedures, just because we have all this technology in place does not mean that when something goes wrong, that the average frontline person will do the right thing. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what I've been thinking is interesting that is coming down the path, and this AI driven, okay, is instead of training or let's say tabletopping or simulations, that I'm beginning to see some, or I think there's an opportunity there, and I think it's an and, not an or. Okay. But I think it's an and that will really allow organizations to understand whether or not their technology and their teams can really handle the problems that we're talking about. So an AI driven tool that is stepping your people through a real scenario, not training 45 minutes, answer a bunch of questions. Right. We're really forcing them through. This was I'm calling in because I have not gotten an email in 4 days. Okay. I'm a tech. What do I do?
Yep.
All right. Okay. Depending what they do, right? Some of them might go right off the script. I know there's very clear things to do, but what you're going to find is most of the time they don't. Okay. And that those type of, let's say, opportunities as compliance and security and the issues, whether it's HIPAA or PCI, I think there's the technology is now creating different ways to solve or at least make sure the problem is as solved as it can be, or lower the risk.
Absolutely. So AI is a huge thing in this industry. In fact, I actually wanted to ask you about that. I mean, do you think that we wouldn't be the Technocratic podcast if we weren't talking about AI and its impact on corporate life and corporate America? How much will AI revolutionize? 3 years from now, will every major corporation in America be revolutionized because of AI, or is this mostly hype?
So I think historically there's been many new technologies that everyone assumed would change the world, or is going to end the world, whichever way you look at it. I think AI is the culmination of probably one of the most powerful things I've ever seen, right? But I don't think it's inherently good or bad, right? I do think people would be foolish. Look, you used to use a horse, and then you could drive a car, and there's a powerful truck, and boats used to go, used to have a sailboat, and then now you have an engine that can go much faster. You know what I'm saying? The evolution of better tools to do things. I think AI is just part of that. Yeah. The fact that it has this conceptual that it's learning how to think for itself is just a new challenge. I don't think we've ever dealt with quite that way. Yeah. Right. I mean, a basic computer followed a program. It didn't learn, it followed what you told it to do. And in some ways you could say that AI is doing. Now, as far as the practical, look, I think everybody's using it now. I mean, you don't even write a text back to your wife without Grammarly telling you what you said wrong, right? You know what I'm saying? And I think it's actually a great use. One of the concerns, and I have not gotten a good answer from anybody yet, so I'm going to throw it out there as an AI potential challenge. If AI is now generating all our content, right? So in other words, you think of, let's say, informational content that gets shared. And it's also AI that reads the content that then does the content. Yeah. When are we ever going to do anything? Right. We're not involved in the equation anymore. Yeah. It's going to sell to itself, divide its own technology. It's going to solve its own problem. Right. I do think in the end, I think there'll be a lot of years before the world is completely overcome by AI. But I do think AI is a good thing. I think on the regulatory side, I am very curious to see how they're going to put some sort of controls in to make sure this thing doesn't just get abused, right? Because you can teach it to do bad things.
Exactly. The difficulty is that, when you're on social media and if it's just humans to humans talking, okay, that's one thing, and it's playing into the innate human psychology of wanting to connect with other people. And that's good. AI comes along, takes humans out of the equation. Now AI is just talking to itself on these platforms. And I think the platform providers will have to think of a way to combat that issue. They're going to have to come up with some solution to this issue, because as soon as they see their revenues tanking, they're going to be like, wait a second, we need to deal with this. But I think it's going to be one of the biggest challenges to Facebook, Meta, Apple, LinkedIn, just all these different platforms. Maybe not Apple as much because they don't run as much of a social media platform, but the other big ones, I don't know if they're going to survive solving this problem. I think new companies will come up and they may solve it. They may be AI native companies themselves and use AI to solve this AI only talking to itself problem, because the AI is getting so good, and I obviously am immersed in AI all the time as a tech guy. Every week there's some improvement on it, it's mind blowing. I haven't seen this much innovation happen since when the internet first started, and so, this problem is going to get worse, but I don't think the current companies, the top companies, platforms are going to solve it. I think some other companies but they'll get bought by the big companies, and then
they'll get bought by the companies. Well, it's a great approach because I spent a lot of time in advertising technology. Okay. So from what was the original infomercial DRTV all the way through the ad, online ad, display ad, what Amazon is today, what TikTok is as far as presenting to you what you were looking for. I think the positive thing is technology is making it better and better for you to see what you want. Okay. In other words, like I want content I'm fascinated with knots. Why? Don't know. I get a knot feed every day. Okay?
Sailor knots.
Okay. For whatever reason, it's my thing.
You live in Florida, so it makes sense.
It's not changing my world. There's no sinister platform, taking my job away. Right. I find it interesting, and I like to watch it. Right. And I think AI is doing a really good job of finding the things around the world that I would find fascinating to see because I'm interested in knots, and I think that's a great application of AI. I think you're right that think of over the years how many technologies have been completely replaced by a new technology. You would have swore that the BlackBerry was never going to go away, right? It was obsolesced in 3 years? Okay, its life ended, right? Or I'm sorry, it still exists, but not quite what it was.
Yeah.
Right? So I think it'll happen. I do. The only thing that I do think on the social media, which is more of a human nature problem, I don't think this is actually it used to be you got one newspaper that showed up. You lived in the wild, wild west. You got a newspaper that showed up once a month, and that was all your news, right? It could be completely wrong, false, created, whatever. You have the same challenge today. AI is just generating so much content coming at you. You still have to ask yourself: is this content that I think is relevant? Is it what I want to read? Is it source something that I consider credible? And I think that's going to change the game. Is you're right that there's going to be another way of doing this that solves that problem, so that it is less subjective. But I think it's exciting. Especially I know a lot of regulatory people on my side are like, "Oh my God, you got to lock this thing down." I'm like, "You're not locking anything down, man. Why don't we just understand what it does?
That's going to be tough.
Why don't we see what it can really do?" And
the EU can try to do it probably, but I don't know what's going to happen. We'll see. All right. Well, I think we're at the end of our time. It was a pleasure talking with you today, Marc.
Bobby, thank you as always. And this was great. It's fun to talk. I enjoy getting out and speaking with people with interesting insights on the world. And, let's see in about 6 months, a year, what we were right about, what we were wrong about.
Yeah, exactly. We got to do this again sometime. I'm sure our listeners will have taken a lot out of this discussion, Marc. So thank you all for tuning in. And you can catch all the rest of our podcasts on www.technocratic.io. We have some amazing guests like Marc with really practical insights for executives. In the meantime, keep the sharks swimming, and I'll see you next week.